So one expression that you had, I think, is a perfect segue between the concept of embodied cognition and the concept of flow, and that's controlled perception, right? Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow as order in consciousness, right? Ordering your consciousness from moment to moment. And so you're also the chief science officer for the Flow Research Collective, founded by Stephen Kotler, whose work is amazing. And if anybody is not cognizant of it, I think definitely strongly recommended. But there's a rich scientific literature and experimentation around the concept of flow. So just quick recap, these states where people feel amazing and also perform at their best. Csikszentmihalyi always says that, we don't feel at our best when we're on a hammock sipping a drink. We feel at our best when we're actively challenging ourselves with something, growing from the experience, bringing order and consciousness, transcending our limitations. Athletes talk about being in the zone. So kind of being fully focused and immersed on an activity, having 100% focus around the thing that we're doing. And it's not just peak performers. There was a lot of initial work around flow for peak performers. It's also ordinary people who, report having more happiness and joy and purpose when they experience more flow and engagement in their lives. So there's obviously the concept of flow, and that's a whole huge thing. But I want to direct your attention on an aspect of flow that doesn't have as maybe rich a literature, that people are maybe less aware of, and that you're very involved in researching and in studying, and that's group flow. So entering kind of flow states as a group, right? Not just as an individual, but also as a group. So the difference between an agglomeration of individuals, everybody being active, and a synchronized group, right, around shared goals, maybe shared values even. I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about the science of flow as it relates specifically to group flow, and what can maybe lead to it? Because I know that's an area that you've researched a lot and very deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me see if I can. And I think I got a Neil Seth's quote in my head. Just came back to me as you were talking too. So I'll put that back on the back burner for now. Group flow is this phenomenon of, and it's collective flow, shared flow, team flow. There's a bunch of ways to sort of phrase it. And it's been studied now psychologically. Keith Sawyer studied it. He was one of Csikszentmihalyi's first students, or a student of his. And there are certain sets of, triggers or preconditions that make group flow more likely. A guy named J.J. Vandenhout I think his work is like sort of top notch and state of the art when it comes to team flow. And he talks about, team flow is when you're actively pursuing goals, right? There's a shared goal commitment, there's a collective ambition, and there's open communication, and there's mutual commitment, and there's high skill integration, and there's psychological safety, and there's shared goals and aligned personal goals. When those 7 prerequisites, are dialed up and existing, you get this idea of collective flow. Of team flow. And team flow, what are the characteristics that show up? A sense of unity, a holistic progress, trust. So those are these characteristics that show up when all those 7 prerequisites sort of are met and are dialed up and they're existing. And so, and it's interesting that team flow has been studied now at the level of the brain. So flow itself, individual flow, has really been studied at the level of the brain. And, although there's differing data sets out there and differing data and different experiments, we can now conclusively say that flow is a real thing at the level of the brain. Individual flow is a real thing at the level of the brain, right? It's not just a psychological thing.
Yeah, it's measured.
It's measured at the level of the brain. And now it turns out there's one study, just one, that came out in 2021 that showed that team flow also has a neuromarker at the level of the brain, but not of one brain, of many brains. In this case, not many, 2 brains, because they studied dyads. And it turns out that flow, team flow or group flow, or team flow, let's say in this case, because they study team flow, is not just the addition of a bunch of individuals each in flow, team flow itself is a non-linear whole is greater than the sum of the parts state that exists not only in, so there's a neuromarker that correlates with team flow, but that neuromarker doesn't exist in one brain. You have to look at the system.
Oh,
It
really?
only exists at the system level.
How does that work? How is that measured?
It's measured with different ways of looking at brain activity and consciousness, like really advanced statistical methods using, integrated information theory.
It's a relational thing between the brains. It's not necessarily something that you can measure at the individual brain level.
That is correct. That is correct. You just framed it very nicely and articulated it perfectly. And you can use integrated information theory, this theory of consciousness that I was actually referring to earlier in this conversation, they use that, and they showed that team flow was really a global thing that exists at the system level. And so those are some of the antecedents to team flow. And another antecedent, so there's still a lot of research and open questions about, how to measure team flow, what's the framework around it, what are the actual antecedents. One of them is yes, synchrony, interpersonal synchrony has been studied. And they studied this in this paper. They found that the brains synchronize. There's the level of interpersonal synchrony. Brain waves sync up. Not only in team flow, but just in collaboration in general. We know that teams on the same wavelength perform better. Brain waves sync up, like a pilot and a co-pilot. Their brain waves literally sync up when they're taking off and performing the same task at the same time. Not only brain waves, but like heart rates, respiratory rates, galvanic skin response, a bunch of other markers, biomarkers, physiological biomarkers synchronize when people that predicts group cohesion and team performance and trust, cooperation.
Performance must be, so I'm thinking like at the individual level, when you look at the way individual performance skyrockets when people are in flow, I would assume that there are performance benefits at the group level when the group enters this kind of synchronous like group flow state.
100%.
And so it would almost be like okay, when we're a bunch of selfish individuals that each have their own personal goal, it would seem like the group loses something. Is that an idea that you can vibe with?
Yes, I can vibe with that for sure. Like when you have aligned personal goals, that adds to the group and the collective ambition. Yes, 100%. Especially with like the task that you're trying to do, or the problem that you're trying to solve, or decision that you're trying to make, or as a group. And so, yes, absolutely. And performance does increase. I mean, not only when people get in sync, performance increases. Like not only in music or sports, as those are paradigmatic examples, but like just putting something together with your hands, or figuring out you have a problem to solve together, and you've done experiments, like all kinds of scientific experiments out there, where they get people in sync and then the performance goes up, rather than if they're just working together but not in sync.
Is there anything that can knock the group out of flow, like certain behaviors or certain, I guess one of the 7 triggers that you mentioned, like if one of them were removed, or but this is like, what could knock a group out of flow where it could, like, the performance would go down and the synchrony would go down?
Great question. So some of the original group flow triggers that Keith Sawyer looked at were like ego blending, equal participation, familiarity, like open communication, familiarity. There's a trigger called yes and, so being additive, right, to the conversation. If you're in a situation where you're having a conversation, that's not going to, the yes and doesn't apply, to a jazz quartet or, a football team. But so he studied improv and he studied jazz musicians actually as well. So yeah, those are the group flow triggers. If they're not all there, or they're not all dialed up, flow exists in a spectrum. So does group flow, I believe. I think the research will bear that out. First of all, but then there are, I guess, group flow blockers, just as there are individual flow blockers. Distraction, limited beliefs, self-sabotage, overwhelm, those kinds of things are.
Would you put like I don't know why I had this idea when you mentioned interruptions or just tuning out of the moment. University students surfing on social media while the teacher is taught. I don't know if you have that at the university there, but I have a lot of my friends teach at the university level, and they just say like, look, you can't say anything because if you say anything, they'll give you a bad rating as a prof. It's almost like there's like the client relationship now, but that behavior doesn't seem to be conducive to group flow or like establishing some kind of a synchronous group dynamic around the exploration of an idea or learning.
Yeah, no, the research out of Susan Dicker's lab at University of Montreal and one of my colleagues, Guillaume Dumas, they've studied education and this idea of synchrony in education. And they found out that when students are paying to get attention together, you hit the nail on the head, man. When they found a neuromarker of joint attention when students were focused on the same lesson and paying attention together in a classroom. And they were students in a classroom with EEG sets on their heads, and they were focused on the same lesson, and they found a joint neuromarker for attention. So that is, this joint neuromarker is a neuromarker for attention, but it only exists at the joint group level of the students. So learning and memory enhances when students get into sync. And so you can actually, like, if we're going to take a test together, let's all get calm together. Or if we're about to learn a lesson, let's all pay attention together and know that we're all paying attention and we have a shared goal and that kind of thing. So that's been shown, like interpersonal synchrony in education for paying attention has been shown.
Wow. Such a fascinating science, group flow, because I find that as a society, a lot of our challenges will require group. We can't just solve it as a bunch of like separated and like selfish individuals. We're going to have to attack shared problems, turn them into shared goals, and then become effective as groups. And I find that this science of group flow that's kind of, or team flow, collaborative flow that's emerging. It's just refreshing how, first of all, it's completely apolitical, right? It's really just structured around, we can talk about what the goals should be, but to the extent that we can agree on goals, and to the extent that we can agree on problems, we're going to have to get better as a species in this kind of practice of group flow, find ways to kind of sync up together as productive teams and attack these complex problems, as opposed to, I don't know, just endlessly arguing over minutia detail to figure out who gets the power, to figure out who is the top monkey in the hierarchy, that we currently have, like attacking these problems like politically or through a culture war paradigm. It's like, okay, like let's agree there's a problem. There's a level of the problem at which we can agree that there is a problem. Okay. Now, how do we mobilize our attention and our resources as a group to solve that problem? So I find it's a great, it's a really, really cool discipline that's emerging, and with the scientific understanding backing it up, that it's really an area where I hope there's more research, more attention, more awareness that gets built around that, because it's potentially really really unbelievable from a human progress perspective.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, man. And Stephen Kotler actually makes this point very well at the end of his book that he wrote with Peter Diamandis, "The Future is Faster Than You Think." This idea of the hive mind, and the group flow is the state on the most pleasurable state on the planet that everybody knows that and experiences it. If you've experienced group flow or team flow, it is. It's like all of the pleasure chemistry that you get and motivation chemistry that you get in individual flow, which is a very pleasurable state, is like amplified when you're a group flow. And so he makes the point that this is what we need to tackle these global problems. He makes the point that you're making right now, and we need to figure out collaboration, how to collaborate, but getting in that state facilitates cooperation and collaboration and human connection. And so getting in sync is part of that equation. And we absolutely need to figure out how to do that. I think when we learn how to do that, when we learn how to get in sync, we learn how to take each other's perspectives. And this has actually been shown. Guillaume, one of my colleagues, as I mentioned before, at University of Montreal, has shown empathy increases when we get in sync. Okay, so like between mother and child, between strangers, between friends, like when we get in sync, literally, and I'm not talking about like, hey, we're in sync, colloquially, I'm talking about like biologically, when we get in sync, when we're in synchrony, empathy, those things increase so we can take each other's perspective, because there's two kinds of empathy. There's affective empathy, like, literally putting yourself in, not literally putting yourself in someone's shoes, but you're feeling literally the way they feel. So you're putting yourself in their shoes. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is taking their perspective on a more intellectual level, not so much the affective level, but the cognitive level. And he showed that those two happen when people get into sync. So think about like conflict resolution, disagreeing about same-sex marriage, disagreeing about gun regulation and these kinds of things. So those things, in my opinion, I'm very passionate about critical thinking, and I think critical thinking, if people learn to think critically and the skills and strategies therein, will help those situations. But even more than that, just going beyond that, from an intellectual critical thinking, getting into sync and getting into group flow will be the way we can really affect those at the level of the brain. Again, I can take your perspective, I can understand where you're coming from, and we can then, resolve conflicts, tackle problems, and understand each other better.
Find pragmatic solutions to these problems in a way that incorporates the perspectives of others, and not just kind of forcing your perspective through, for example, a political solution or a legal solution, and locking out, millions of people out. So it's very interesting. There are a lot of implications here at the social organization level that touch sort of every level, from like individual to small team to bigger team to sort of, okay, now we've got a community, right, in a large territory, all the way up to these really big problems. Really fascinating area.
And Fred, it shouldn't be lost on the viewers that it can go the other way too. Like flow is value neutral, right? Like, so is group flow. Think about National Socialism. Think about the Nazis. Think about there was a lot of group flow there, probably.